Good afternoon. Welcome to Cranbrook Art Museum. I'm Andrew Blauvelt, the director. I hope you have had the opportunity or will have the opportunity after today's talk to view our new exhibitions, including Allie McGee, Banana Moonhorn, the first retrospective of one of the pillars of Detroit's art scene, whose innovative practice adds a rich dimension to the realm of Black abstraction, and James Hefner, Michigan Modern, which captures the rich architectural legacy of Michigan's many contributions to development of modern architecture. I invite you to a talk, or note a talk that will be happening by James Hefner and Brian Conway as they discuss that project, Michigan Modern, an Architectural Legacy, which began as a book that expansively documents so many important examples of modernism across the state. That talk will be next Thursday night here in the DeSalle Auditorium and live stream on the DeSalle channel on YouTube. You can also find a link on our website to that link on YouTube, and you can also register there for being here in person and in the DeSalle Auditorium. I'd also like to note that Laura Mott, who will be one of the presenters this evening, or this afternoon, will be in conversation with artist Allie McGee on Thursday evening, November 11th at 6 p.m. So please note that. And a special welcome to our viewers who are watching live on our channel. It's great to have you as part of our audience as well. Last night, we were able to preview the exhibition Olga de Amaral, To Weave a Rock, a project that began here at Cranbrook in 2017 and grew along the way. An important early partnership emerged between Cranbrook Art Museum and the Museum of Fine Arts Houston to organize the exhibition and the accompanying catalog. We would like to acknowledge the generosity of the following entities in making the project a reality, including the National Endowment for the Arts, the Graham Foundation for Advanced Studies in Fine Arts, and a Craft Research Fund grant from the Center for Craft. Today, we have the curators of this important exhibition with us to share their insights into the remarkable work of Olga de Amaral, who was introduced to weaving in 1954 when she came to study at Cranbrook Academy of Art. So, we'll be first watching a short film, just about 8 minutes, I think, in length, that gives you a great introduction to Olga, who is unfortunately not able to travel here, especially with the pandemic happening, but that will give you some insight. And I will introduce both speakers who will follow that film. First, I believe you're first, right? Okay, is Anna Walker, who's the executive director of Lawndale, a multidisciplinary center for contemporary art in Houston. Prior to Lawndale, Walker was assistant curator of decorative arts, craft, and design at the Museum of Fine Arts Houston. She previously served as a curator at Houston Center for Contemporary Crafts. She studied at Urbana University in Ohio with a focus on ceramics and printmaking before receiving her MA in arts administration from Indiana University. Following Anna will be Laura Mott, who is the newly appointed chief curator of Cranbrook Art Museum. Since her arrival at the museum in 2013, Mott has organized many exhibitions on contemporary art and design, including Allie McGee, Banana Moonhorn, which I just mentioned, on view now, and Landlord Colors on art economy and materiality, and Nick Cave, Here. Prior to Cranbrook, Mott's curatorial practice included positions at the Gothenburg Konsthalle in Sweden, IASPIS in Stockholm, Mission 17 in San Francisco, and the Whitney Museum of American Art. I think you'll gain some incredible insights into what is one of today's most remarkable artists from this afternoon's presentation. But first, we'll invite you to watch this amazing video produced by Andrew Miller for Cranbrook Art Museum about the work and life of Olga de Amaral. Let's roll that.
My name is Olga de Amaral. What do? Play around. I start playing around seriously like 50 years ago. I went to Cranbrook. I loved it from the beginning because I was completely free with myself. Free with what I was doing too, because it's the first time that I heard the word weaving. In a sense, everything was a discovery, but I am a very tenacious person. When I started the loom, I thought it was a very complicated machine, but my father and my brothers are engineers, so I have a little of construction. The first time that I sit down, everything was arranged, and I put the warp, and then when I crossed with the web, you see, and I started weaving, and that was, I was in love immediately. It's a beautiful experience. As simple as it was fantastic for me. I was feeling what I was doing, and it's always a great pleasure. And then to see what was happening when you start mixing the colors. I could probably be a painter if I would have gone to painting, because for me it was like painting, me always mixing, and I loved it. Especially because I discovered color. That color was really in my mind, in my soul, in my everything. The discovery of color probably was the most important thing that happened to me. I live color, It's like a language for me. It never finishes. And I am not conscious about it. It's just something that lives in me, because it's part of my essence, almost. And there was the texture too, and the structure, three things. Because geometry for me is so basic, in a sense. It's a basic, I love always geometry. Of course, there is a lot of different aspects of geometry, but to use the three basic ones, the triangle, the circle, and the square, is always, for me, very magic, somehow. In the north part of Colombia, the women use for clothing like a kaftan. So once I decided I was going to make a collection, I was very happy. When I took them out of the loom, like this, I remember very clearly in my mind. And I have sort of to finish, and to see it. In Colombia, I think the vegetation, the mountains, the color of the savanna, I think it has an influence in my color scheme, because there is a sadness in this color here. The colors are not bright. The mountains are black, green, dark green. So in a sense, that is engraved. The landscape is all over you. What I want to make, woven walls. First problem that I had was that the fiber is usually very thin. So I did bands with horsehair. They were very coarse. And then when I did the bands, I could do any size, That was thinking that very much in space. I was thinking in architecture. I was wanting to do my own space. Sometimes it's accidental, The process gives you ideas. And I let myself talk about it because it's a surprise. And it's a nice surprise. Solving problems is part of my creativity. I like to solve problems. I like to solve it without concession. You have to sort of work and work and work until I see it the way I want to. And I like that process. Way of moving your mind. It happens a lot. I am very relaxed about those changes because they're like whispers, I get those whispers that it's not there, you know. So because there's always like a kind of a language, you know, between the work and one, you know, part of the creation, really. I relate the word art because it is art, because there is no other name. It's not sculpture, it's not painting. Art is a creative thing. And I think my thoughts and my way of working and my visions are art, are creative for me. Art is a strong emotion. It really comes from your heart, from your mind, your whole being together. And look how many things you can do with that. Amazing.
It really is an amazing film, and she's amazing to work with, and hard act to follow right now today for Laura and I. Olga's so poetic with her words, but we wanted to make sure to share that with everyone because I really think it sets the scene. My name's Anna Walker. I just want to express a real heartfelt thanks to the Cranbrook Art Museum and Andrew for that very kind introduction. Also to Laura, my co-curator, dear friend, and all of the team that helped install this installation. It's really magical upstairs, so I hope everyone will get a chance to see it. I'm going to begin with a little bit of where Olga began. She was born in 1932 in Bogota, Colombia, where she grew up. And as she mentions in the film, with all of her siblings, she was surrounded by engineers, but also she herself really excelled in the field of math. And she went on to get her first degree in architectural drafting. And it was that degree and her peers of fellow architects that prompted her to learn about Cranbrook and the academy here and seek out a year in 1954 to 55 with the artist Marian Strengel. And here you see her in her weaving studio at the Cranbrook Academy of Art. And during her time here at Cranbrook, she was a visiting artist, so she wasn't a enrolled student in the say of receiving a degree, but that year of study with Marian Strengel, as she says, really changes her life. It really introduces her to weaving. It's where she embraces this experimental ethos that is so central to the campus here and her individual pursuits at the loom. And she returns to Bogota and she sets up an atelier. That atelier that she sets up initially in the 1950s is focused on making materials for interior spaces, also a line of fashion and dresses, which you saw some great images of. And she spends time really exploring colorways, and her colorways are drawn from the landscape, but she does a visit with the fellow alum, Lillian Elliott, in the late 1950s. Her husband, Jim Amaral, Olga's husband at the time, is from the Bay Area where Lillian is. And during a studio visit, Lillian encourages Olga to really think about how innovative her colorways are and think about using them to start to explore the potential of making individual works of art for the wall, and that is something she mentions in an interview and returns back to, when she returns to Bogota, she starts to really pursue that, and that begins in the 1960s. And here we see an early installation image of some of that early experimentation and these interlaced series, which were the first bodies of work that she was making with the intention of showing these in art museum contexts, hanging, as you can see in the 1965 archival image, away from the wall or in space. These are more, domestic in scale, and they're really embracing the qualities that she could explore from the loom with the grid. Many of you who are here, I would assume, but I'm not going to assume, the loom, you have a warp and a weft that meet on right angles. And so as you can see in this gridded tapestry here to the right, she's really taking on that theme and starting to interlace her different bands, explore negative space, and think about the sort of qualities that she can achieve both on the loom, and then she would also be utilizing off-loom techniques later on in her career. I'm moving pretty quickly to get us to sort of this formative period of the late 1960s. She exhibits first one of those interlaced works at the Wall Hangings exhibition in MoMA, which was co-curated by Jack Lenore Larson and Mildred Constantine in 1969. And that's really the first work that she shows at a major museum outside of Latin America. And then she shows a small body of work at Jack Lenore Larson's studio space in New York. And then he has her work, and then her work, this Woven Walls series, is the first sort of major solo installation that she does, solo museum show that she does outside of Latin America, at the Museum of Contemporary Crafts, now the Museum of Arts and Design in New York City in 1970 to 71. For the Woven Walls, we see a real increase in scale. We see her experimentation moving from these sort of small gridded studies to large woven wall works that are actually meant to be free-forming. You walk around them in the space. Also, her embracing of this architectural intervention really harkens back to that early degree that she had received in architectural drafting. You see these sort of influences merging together for her. And the works from this time period are really in keeping with other major artists working in fiber of the time that are exploring issues of scale and space and structure for their fiber works. Here we see a closer up view of the work that's in the Museum of Arts and Design's collection. And while those woven wall works were perhaps, even though very taking up a lot of the space, she does start to investigate other forms with those. Here you see an installation of woven walls from the Museo de Arte and Moderno in Bogota, in Colombia, and she's moving to the floor. So she's moving from the wall to the floor with this work in the Minneapolis Institute of Arts collection, and then to more of a sort of columns in space. This is a short, this is a decade that she's really pushing her materials and shifting very quickly into the sculptural realm within her textile practice. And these works all also utilize color palettes that are muted and take their inspiration from vegetation and the landscape of Colombia, as you might have seen from the video pieces and what she also describes. They were also using a lot of natural dyes as well at that time. So this is the 1960s and 70s. For the column works, she only makes only a few of those works before she shifts to the 1980s, introducing a whole new color palette with the color, what she calls the color of gold. So when Laura and I were first working on this exhibition, we've grouped these different themes, not necessarily chronologically, as you'll see in our talk today, but more thematically. And so that those works that were really exploring the loom that I just showed you were part of this Rebel Warp body of work, and that we sort of titled the Rebel Warp. Here we're moving into alchemy, and alchemy takes its title also from this first body of work that she did in the 1980s, where she starts to apply gold leaf to her textiles, to the woven tabs, and really thinking about gold not just as for its, she really discounts its references to sort of spirituality or place, but more at its formal qualities and its reflective qualities of light and color into the space, how you might enter the space as you'll experience these works. Here, the color reflects off the light reflects off them and sort of washes you in the color of gold as well. This is an installation shot from the Museum of Fine Arts Houston's presentation earlier this late summer. And the alchemy works, while they begin with sort of small moments and introductions of gold, the accumulation, this is a body of work that she is still, as you see, this work is from 2014, that she is still exploring and working on. It really becomes part of her sort of visual language today, and becomes even more and more a part of these works. Once the sort of gold is introduced into her material practice and the material exploration for her and her work, and the sort of experimentation of materials that Laura will touch on a little bit further, we see it becoming sort of smaller elements too. Here is her lienzo ceremonial works, where the threads are sort of interlacing down at the bottom, and gold is kind of introduced as just this, give a nice little detail, as a real sort of element accentuating the colorways that are happening. The title of alchemy, obviously, is also, we can think about its historical references to transforming the everyday materials into something precious and valuable, but also this transformation of textile and gold leaf. I think with Earth and Gold too, this work here that you'll see in the gallery spaces, the gradations of color up on the top are all done through the weaving of the textile practices and fibers, ending with these golden tabs. So the sort of colorways and the color stories that you're seeing too, referencing to the land, but also that interplay of textile and gold leaf sort of together in harmony. I went through that very quickly, but I'm going to switch over to Laura, who's going to take up with our radical materialism.
Thank you so much, Anna. This has been just like such a joy, this project, to create together. And we got to spend 2 summers with Olga in Bogota, and that was one of my career highlights, actually. So bringing you this exhibition upstairs is both something I think everyone should be looking at art historically, and something that can bring so many new ideas to our students, and to even how we're positioning kind of craft works within a larger context of contemporary art. But it's also very emotional for me, and just unbelievably gratifying. So I'm going to talk a little bit about Olga's work in a little bit more of an expanded field. I think this is something that's been really a discovery for me. I think a lot of people know Olga. If they do know her work, they know her work from gold, or they know her work within craft. And I think that there's a much larger conversation to have around her work, which I think is very exciting, and something that we really felt as curators was revelatory to how people see her work and contextualize her work. And I even think the idea of alchemy, of the alchemist, is a really important figure in thinking about Olga. Of course, she has her series called Alchemy. A lot of these works are named Alchemy, or named Alchemy. But the kind of alchemist figure, even historically, is someone who is just lives in a space of constant discovery. I think the way that she functions, the way she tests materials, and almost like thinks almost metaphysically about how the direction that she's going with this kind of experimentation also really relates to how we consider the contemporary artist today. So to me, she's really is this kind of alchemist figure. And I think it also kind of coincides with the idea of like materials and their properties. And as seen in the exhibition upstairs, her desire to experiment with light, color, and texture. This leads her to seek out materials beyond fiber, including horsehair, gold leaf, clay, and plastic. So this is an installation image from the Museum of Fine Arts of Houston, and you can see there is a documentation of an outdoor installation that she has here called Dry Leaves. And she's just like a direct collaboration with nature. She's using wool and horsehair to kind of act as camouflage amid this rock formation in the Colombian landscape. And these like sculptural gestures are kind of like a meditative reintroduction of the organic material to their native environment. This strategy of mimesis, I think, is really kind of beautiful. And really she sees her, weaving as an extension of the landscape. She has a quote in which she says, "In this end is a primal idea that landscape is nothing more than an extension of weaving, that is only a mantle covering the earth." Also, the scholar Matthew Drutt, I think, kind of sums up also how Olga starts to function kind of away from like a two-dimensional tapestry. He says she gradually moved fabric-based works beyond the category of woven tapestry, one that privileges flatness, adherence to the wall, pictorials, and obsession with organic and the physical properties of materials, into a more conceptual practice that embraces strategies otherwise found in painting, sculpture, and architecture. We have one of these works upstairs in the gallery, but I wanted to show this installation shot from the 1960s. This is the Light series, and here she's weaving like these cascading pieces of plastic, and she was really inspired to do this because of the really peculiar light that the plastic induced. And I mean, when we asked her about it, she's like, well, I'll try to weave anything. So, this was just the things that she was finding. She's constantly testing and experimenting. And you can see back in this installation here, the work we have upstairs, it really does kind of take this form as like a cascading waterfall. She's thinking about like water and light when she's creating this work. But I think there's something also really fascinating about her use of materials. For instance, the work that's organic and uses horsehair, I mean, that's a material that goes very far back on the human timeline of ingenuity. Paintbrushes or surgical sutures or all those different ways that we use horsehair. But her use of plastic is a very 20th century material. And it's something to where when we look at it now, it is a material that carries the politics of its time. So when she first is using this material in the 1960s, plastic is still seen as kind of a miracle material. It's kind of miraculous. Then it becomes something that's quite utilitarian and part of our everyday lives. But when you see this piece now in 2021, all that kind of plastic, we know what happens with that material. We know that it doesn't decompose. We know that it's one of the kind of assaults on our environment. So it's also interesting to think about these works in our contemporaneous moment and whether they go back far in our timeline or have a very short one. I also think there's something really interesting happening in this work that she's doing this in the late 60s, 1970s. And she's having these collaborations with the landscape, and this is very similar to what was also happening in the land art and earthworks movements the same time period. And this was an era where art started to have many kind of different temporal and spatial realities. And I think there's this one quote by Robert Smithson that I think is very interesting in regards to this work, where he says, "The new monuments of the 21st century are made with artificial materials, and therefore they're not built for the ages, but rather against the ages." And it's like these kind of collaborations also with the landscape and this kind of materiality, I think is also something that really opened up my mind about Olga's work and thinking about it in relationship to the other kind of conversations that were happening within contemporary art at the same time. I mean, this was, this era, for instance, like with Smithson, who's working directly with the landscape, and there's something very kind of also corporal about her relationship to her materials, even thinking about how textiles are also something that was kind of traditionally meant to protect and be on the body and be part of our kind of experience. But there's like this nice way in which we're kind of dealing with the natural world, but also our relationship to it. That's something that's very important to her when she kind of talks about her materiality and how she's thinking about in creating her work. I also have this one work here by Robert Smithson, but also work by Anna Mendieta, where I think there's something just kind of fascinating about this meditative practice of collapsing the human and natural worlds that's embedded in the way that Olga's work functions. And I think even when you go upstairs and you encounter some of that work, I mean, it's so bodily, like how your relationship to it. And that's even evident in some of the columns and kind of even thinking about how we think about architecture. It's really about our relationship to our body and space. And that's so much what I think is that kind of the core of Olga's practice. She's also dealing with scale in such a fascinating way. This is also what she calls kind of the zeitgeist of the time. This is a work that she created called The Great Wall. It's 6 stories high. It was created for a hotel in Atlanta. But I mean, even just seeing like the amount of collaboration, this idea of scale, like it's really incredible, this kind of monumental thinking, and something that, in a way, when I think about Olga's work, she's like a fiber artist, but I also very much see her as an architect and a sculptor, in the way that she like actually really follows through with these ideas. And one more. Here's another installation image from the 1970s. And it's not just an artwork, it's also an environment. It's architecture in the same way it's meant to be immersive. And what's interesting is that for these outdoor installations, they exist like temporarily. They exist in documentation, like many of the other kind of interventions from the same time period. So even this notion of duration, I always go back to that when I'm thinking about sometime when I went with Olga and her affinity for things like rocks. And we have a shared affinity for rocks. Anyone who knows me knows that about me. But it's, this is an installation that she created outside of her home, her kind of country house in the countryside of Colombia. And the work on the left is the Estella series. So this is her actually creating work or kind of weaving rocks in relationship to this outdoor installation that she's built over decades, where she's collecting these large rock slabs that are meant to be commemorative, like they're meant to, have some kind of relationship to an event or an active memory. So she's been building this over time, and it's served as like the core inspiration for this installation, which you can also see upstairs. And I think that there is, just something kind of beautiful about her creating her own rock conglomerates over time. So kind of continue to talk about this expanded view of Olga, really especially in the last couple of decades of her life, she's really leaned a lot more towards sculpture and painting. So she's using like paint actually for her explorations of color, not necessarily only dyeing like fiber material. So in this section we call the line, we're really exploring these later bodies of work. And here she's like completely abandoned the loom with a lot of free-hanging fringe-like threads, and they're directly a paint is directly applied to them, just like a canvas. And she, really, I think, is like working as like a painter and sculptor, and also within the realm of fiber as her material, but also always within this architectural lens. And I think that's one of the most fascinating things about an artist, where some of her work she's making in her 70s, 80s, she's turning 90 next year, is some of her most innovative work that she's made throughout her lifetime. And that just kind of is really testament to her alchemist mind and that kind of, constant life of exploration, like a life of hypothesis. So in these 3 works that we see here in the middle, they're called nudos or knots. And she gave a really great quote to Glenn Adamson about this series that I want to read to you. She said, "The beginning of textile, the kernel of a textile is a knot. I want to monumentalize this incredible technology. I want to scale up in dimensions. The knot is the seed of everything. In these works, I amplify the size of the thread, thickening it layer by layer with acrylic paint, enlarging it. I want to make the thread and the knot more visible, giving them the weight of the importance they deserve. This scaling up of discrete components of the textile elements is something I've pursued from the 70s. So these are from 2013. So this is kind of how she's still progressively thinking and deconstructing and even taking something like the knot, like this really core element of textile, but making it something sculptural and an amplified monumentality, I think is really an expression of her, again, her architectural mind working on scale. And you'll see these kind of tenets of architecture continuing. She talks about her love of geometry. She has a fascination with the cosmological diagrams and things like sacred geometry and the symbolic meanings that they develop between shape, proportion, and symmetry. And, kind of sourcing back to these earliest forms of communication, which are the foundations of our language, but also the spaces that we inhabit. And her exploration of color continues. It even gets a little bit brighter. She's moving away from just like those colors of the landscape. But here kind of you can almost see this almost patchwork. This is from the 1990s, like a very early work. But as is evident in the works upstairs, she starts to get even more kind of bright and bombastic with her use of color, kind of taking it like outside of reality and more into the ethereal. I think there's also another amazing thing, if you're kind of looking at particularly a work like this upstairs, is that she's really thinking through like what the possibilities are with this as a fiber material. So here's a work called Black Hole, where it's painted, all the threads, but she does this reveal where you can see underneath the layer of threads the sun peeking out from the black hole, like the eclipse. And like that's such an amazing dexterity and deftness to understand like the potential of these layers of painted thread, which you can't do this with a flat painting, right? Like there's something about the dimensionality of how she's able to really think through about the potential of this new direction of her work. And then the Bruma installation upstairs. I mean, this is an ongoing installation from 2013. She's been creating these incredible works. And these are also just, painted threads. And the inside of the threads, she kind of creates and paints this geometric form, shape that's suspended in the center. The title of the work, Brumas, also means mists. So even when you walk by them, you can affect them. You can see them kind of like gently move. And they kind of create this really experiential environment and like very theatrical too. I mean, the audience moves around the installation to create the shapes in their own personal sightline. There's no version of this work where I'm going to see the same thing that the person next to me, because it's so conditional on what I'm looking at. And it really, again, foregrounding the kind of a bodily experience, kind of the spectator turned participant in a kind of position that's so central that they're necessary for the artwork to be activated. Without us, the work is incomplete. And there's some interesting relationships to be made with some other Latin American abstraction artists, Lydia Pape here on the left, and Jesus Rafael Soto, the Venezuelan artist. But there's something kind of with her work, there's a fragility, and again, kind of going back to that material of fiber, in which that she's able to kind of take these like kind of visual explorations into something that feels so much more like ethereal and like dramatic. And I think there's something also about going back to her very beginnings, studying architectural drafting. These really are like drawings in space. When you go see them upstairs, I think that'll be really evident to you. So these kind of works, she's bringing everything together. Installations that are dependent on the body, this kind of way of drawing, this idea of creating space and creating architecture. The quote that she says about this work is, I want to achieve a sense of floating in space, as though memory were suspended in a mystical space. I want them to become almost transparent, to be presence, to be wall, to be weightless, floating, ingravido. So that's my presentation. I think we're going to, Anna and I are going to sit down and take your questions. Thank you. Hello.
Hello.
Hey, everyone. Thanks for coming on a gray Michigan day. Yes? I can repeat it.
I was wondering if you could expand on what she talks about when she speaks about sadness. I read this to some degree, in everything she talks about in terms of monuments, to look at it with that, more in terms of the weight of these sort of bodies of work. But particularly, I'm interested in, I think, Colombia, and Colombia's sort of second half of the 20th century's fairly violent history, and I wonder if that at all factored into anything that she spoke about her work.
I think that she has talked a little bit about the reality of living in Colombia. We did find an interview with her from the 1980s, kind of talking about the preciousness of materials, like even getting things like paint can be scarce sometimes. And so I think that she has maybe a heightened reverence for materials because of that to some degree. She has done a commemorative public installation that was directly dealing with a political unrest in Colombia. But, I would find more that, well, she's the most joyous person. I think she can recognize sadness, but she lives in such a space of optimism and just constant, creative production. So if anything, she's almost like a testament to humanity, maybe surrounded by conditions that are not always conducive to that.
Yeah, I think when we've spoken with her and certain times during that sort of the last half of the 20th century, there have definitely been points in time where she has spent time away from Colombia, but the majority of her life has been built in Colombia, and she talks so much and so heartfelt about it being her home and that place and its people and the landscape, and just while maybe other artists might have been enticed to live elsewhere, for her, the sense of place, even amongst that sort of turmoil, has been important for her practice, and I think just for her, her as a person. So that's something she really often returns to. It's where she grew up. It's where she loves.
And I think also after we spent some time in Bogota, there's an incredible scene of creative people within Bogota. Even just, we like to go shopping there a lot because there's amazing fashion designers, and it's all incredible and accessible and affordable. And there just seems to be I can understand while someone who is so drawn to a fiber tradition would be very much at home, staying in her home. Mm-hmm. Another question? Yes.
I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the issue of spirituality in her work. On the one hand, it sounds like she is trying to deny that, especially in the Stile series, based on something that one of you said. And yet it seems so evident in them and their frontality. I mean, they really do have this altar-esque quality to them. Does she talk about that anymore at all?
Yeah, so just to rephrase the question's about her relationship to spirituality. And I think I was the one who referenced that within the context of gold, and it's sort of, she talks sometimes about it's, can often be used as representation. For instance, for her in Colombia, the political histories of gold within the myth that was perpetuated in order to entice Spanish colonialists to attempt to eradicate an indigenous population because of the myth of the El Dorado, this gold city, when actually the Muisca people were well known for like their emeralds rather than gold. But there was this myth, and so gold, but gold does come. There is a long tradition and history within Colombia. There's a gold museum there. There are then Spanish colonial churches that are, the interiors are very, like, have a lot of gold in them as well. And so over the course of her career, these references to both ancient gold traditions and the sacred churches have been made for her and her work. And there have been times within her interviews that she has agreed to some of those references, but I think for us working with a living artist, we also need to be respectful of how she embraces and sees her narrative. And in discussing that context for her work today, she prefers to think about gold and her real draw to gold as being the formal characteristics of it as a color and its quality of light. And while she agrees that there might be some of these other sort of histories there, what she foregrounds for her practice is it as a color, and its use in her work as a color. So it's sort of, I know I'm not really like answering the question, but she sort of complicates that as well. And I think for those of us working with artists, you know, there's like, there's sort of a balancing act there that we want to, you know, engage with that topic, but then we also want to be respectful for her and her wishes as well.
Yeah, so someone recently asked her about exactly that word, spirituality. Do you find that to be evident in your work? And I think maybe in part because of just the conversation around gold, or maybe something that she's resisted, like she doesn't see spirituality as something that guides her or within like her practice, but she talks so much about intuition. She talks about so much of reverential about the world. It's almost like a way of being rather than her wanting to lean into maybe the word spirituality.
Yeah, or like poetry and like lyrical, like those are other references that she'll sometimes like talk about, and you can see she has a real way with words too. So, and in talking with her about thinking of words, with all of her titles, over the course of her career, her titles have often been mistranslated. And so we really worked hard with her and her family about focusing on what those translations in Spanish really look like in English for her and her practice, because there are certain bodies of work that the translations were not accurate. And so for her, you know, like those words, but like sort of the difference between maybe something that's poetic and lyrical and something that's spiritual, for her, they're all it's very different. We've like had a conversation with her about the difference. A word was translated as sort of woven wall, like land woven wall, and it instead she wanted it, that it wasn't just land, it was a word, terruno, that's a little more personal for her in Colombian Spanish, and it was homestead was what she preferred that to be. So homestead versus land, that sort of very nuanced conversation was also sort of part of this process.
Yes.
Thank you for the amazing exhibitions you treat. I would be interested in, you were in the studio, and how far is it important for her to actually make the work herself, and how far does she collaborate with others, and how brings she in the technical skills or process of other people in her community to make the work? I'm interested in how that works.
Sure, yeah. So the question's about her and the sort of importance of like her making those works and or relying on others within her community to be working with in her practice as an artist. And her in the 50s when she returned and sets up her atelier where she's making these works for industry, for domestic spaces, for fashion. That's when she first sets up this space with other individuals to be weaving alongside her. And when we talked with her about how that looked to set up, she talks a lot about training and working with women from her community to teach them how to weave based on how she was taught here at Cranbrook. And something I think that maybe isn't foregrounded always is when she came to Cranbrook, she did not speak English. She spoke Spanish. Marian Strangel did not speak Spanish. So there was a lot of teaching that was happening through watching, looking, like a hand language, right? And so she's taking back sort of this knowledge and she's relaying it to her team. And when we were there decades later, she still has a core group of, I think it's about 7 individuals who she works with in the studio, and they're not only part of the practice of making the works, she has a real sort of strong presence in, even at, I guess she was 87, she was there in the studio alongside them, making those works, making decisions with those works. But those are also individuals in her studio practice who I think it's important to point out were also paying bills, were also going to get like lunch, like they're sort of part of this sort of larger community and ecosystem that really, I think, supports her and her practice. I don't know if you want to add anything to what sort of...
Yeah, I know that some of the people who've worked with her have worked with her for decades, that their life has also been in parallel to her life in many ways. And you can even see in like the 6-story tall weaving, how many people are sitting on top of that. That's not something anyone could probably make in their own life, maybe. It is definitely a lot of collaboration that goes into the production, especially when she's dealing with scale. Yeah, and there's also something too that probably happens in parallel, and maybe I'm going a little off book here, but something that happens in parallel as you get older, like the kind of technical weaving and such starts to fall off of her practice and goes more towards things that are painterly, these other kinds of ways. And I think that there's ways in which like her mind starts to almost, just be able to respond to the realities of her life, which I think is pretty interesting to think about. Yes.
Did you hear any comments from her about her inspiration for this group, Miss, that is on the inspiration for that?
So I think, so the question's about inspiration for the work Mists that you see pictured behind us in that latest body of work. And something that I think was really, I feel very grateful for in this case was being able to travel to Bogota and not only visit her in her studio, but spend time with her family traveling to some of the different terrains that exist within the Colombian environment, of which some of those higher plains, Andes mountains, you would see in the morning these sort of mists coming off of the mountains. And so she talks about that experience of place and how that obscures your vision and that sort of ethereal qualities as being translated into some of her approach to making the work. It's not a one-to-one. She's not literally, depicting it, but there is this experience of it that I felt like I was able to have while there. And then seeing the work anew, it made even more sense. I don't know if you felt that with the landscape too, when we sort of traveled down then further, like a little bit outside of Bogota, and we went more into like some of the more more humid, more colorful, like lots of orchids and very like bright vegetation. It's just there are such a huge variety of different sort of biological, like biospheres, or like different terrains that exist in Colombia, and that was something that I maybe had read her talking about before I went, but only to be there really did it click for me.
Yeah, I think it's that relationship between the natural world and the constructed world, the architecture. So for her, like that last quote, she talks about, I want to kind of create space, but I also want it to be invisible. And she's really kind of thinking very conceptually about this idea of kind of these spaces that are almost also something penetrable. And so I think that, the mist is also something like in the natural world where it does create kind of barriers for your eyesight, but it's also something that you can just walk through. So I think it's a combination of those.
Oh, yeah, one back.
What brought her to Cranbrook? It wasn't leaving that she discovered it here. What was the impetus to come from Bogota to West Bloomfield?
So she studied architectural drafting in Bogota, and so she was a peer of others who had studied architecture. And I think she mentions an architect friend of hers who recommended coming to Cranbrook to study, just as a place that he thought she should travel to. And then when she was looking to enroll as a visiting student, and as a woman of the 50s at that time, one of the only studios that was available to her was the weaving studio with Marion Stringell, and so that's what she signed up for, and that's how it happened, sort of word of mouth in this funny way.
Yeah, I mean, I think the history of architecture here was why architects in Columbia and people she knew about Cranbrook, and that was one of the reasons why I think that they directed her here. But the same thing happened at Cranbrook, happened at the Bauhaus. The women were shown to the looms. So, any other questions? Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you, Olga.